Rather than having Israel's back, senior Democrats have actually pressured Israel to end its defensive operations. They've called for a ceasefire and urged leaders to strive for peace through a negotiated two-state solution.
Netanyahu is out there saying that he has a blank check from the United States. That's what he's saying. He says this is going to go on for more time and that the United States is with him. No, we're not. There are many members of Congress, including supporters of the U.S.-Israel relationship, like myself and others, who are saying that Netanyahu does not have a blank check.
Well, the White House dealing with very vocal members of their Democratic caucus up on the Hill about the issue of Israel, its actions against Hamas. The White House putting out a readout of the call with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. President Biden spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu today. The two leaders had a detailed discussion on the state of events in Gaza, Israel's progress in degrading the capabilities of Hamas and other terrorist elements, and ongoing diplomatic efforts by regional governments and the United States. The president conveyed to the prime minister that he expected a significant de-escalation today on the path to a ceasefire. No indication yet that that has happened. We'll see if it does. Let's bring in our panel. Bill Bennett, former Education Secretary, host of the Bill Bennett Show podcast. Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief at USA Today and the author of the book, Madam Speaker, Nancy Pelosi and the Lessons of Power. And Ben Domenech, publisher of The Federalist. Susan, speaking about Speaker Pelosi, she is having to kind of let her caucus speak its mind on this foreign policy issue, but the Biden administration seems to be trying to tiptoe through all of that.
Yeah, I think President Biden had hoped to be as little engaged in this as possible. He certainly hasn't been as outspoken as some, even in his own party, had hoped he would be. Got a little farther forward today in his conversation with Netanyahu. But of course, Democrats are divided on the issue of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. And there are a significant number on the progressive side who thinks the United States should do much more to protect Palestinians, even at the cost of pressuring our longtime ally, Israel. It is a difficult situation for the president, and it's one that I think Pelosi is well aware of because she has all these different voices in her own caucus.
Mm-hmm. Ben, Republicans obviously are jumping on this, saying that there is a Hamas caucus within the Democratic Party.
It is not a difficult situation for the president. The president ought to stand with Israel as America's longtime ally in the Middle East. But unfortunately, I think we see a situation here that the Iranians are looking to exploit. They have been on their heels thanks to the last 4 years, the Trump administration, which saw them really hurt in a lot of different ways, both, seeing the top of their military exercise, essentially knocked off thanks to both the Israelis and the Americans. But also, I think they see a situation where they're trying to seize this moment to lean into this new administration, which has a lot of distrust with Israel and with Bibi Netanyahu, and in trying to essentially attain a new dynamic that would allow them to restore what they were trying to do back in 2015. Unfortunately, I think we're seeing a situation where the incompetence of the Biden administration, their inconsistency when it comes to foreign policy, is leading to benefits for our enemies overseas.
Bill, there are some experts, foreign policy experts, not just Republicans, who say that this all points to Iran and its ability to funnel funds to Hamas and to produce this moment.
Well, certainly the funds that went to Iran were used to make these rockets, which were being launched into Israel. And I think Bibi Netanyahu will stand his ground. As I know him, he will. But further, we are now talking about giving Iran more money. Remember, going back to the table, which means potentially fueling more of this, giving them more funds to produce more rockets. I'll split the difference between Susan and Ben. I agree with Ben. It's not difficult in terms of right and wrong here. Who started this fight and why did they start it? Because they think there should be an end to the state of Israel. But it's a difficult situation for Biden because he doesn't know what he thinks. And he's being pressured by the left caucus. And of course, he also wants to keep good relations with our greatest ally in the world. Bibi Netanyahu knows who he is, knows what he wants to do. Biden is in the process of figuring it out. Welcome to the job, Mr. President.
Meantime, this Nord Stream 2 pipeline that is under construction, Russia desperately wants it to be completed to go into Germany. There's a lot of thought about it as you look at the graphic of where it goes. It's not finished yet. There were stiff sanctions that are being lifted on the company that's constructing it, and there's some more reaction to all of that.
I understand the State Department soon is going to be releasing a report regarding the mandatory sanctions that Congress has imposed in assisting on the building of Nord Stream 2. So I understand that the State Department is going to notify Congress soon.
I'd love to see the argument how this waiver, which seemingly to me, benefits only Vladimir Putin. And we've already disadvantaged the citizens of the United States by not completing the last 100 yards of the Keystone pipeline. So I don't quite follow how that waiver of the national interest occurs.
Susan, what about this, how it plays?
So Bill Bennett said, welcome to the job, Mr. President. It is true that the job is a tough one. It involves balancing interests. This is another example of that. This is not intended as a decision to help Russia. That's a side effect. This is intended as a decision to help Germany, which wanted very much the completion of the pipeline. It puts the administration in this awkward situation, which we've heard about. Tony Blinken, when he was in his confirmation hearings, the Secretary of State said that the United States, the Biden administration, would actively oppose completion of this pipeline. But I think when the balance of interest came out, they came out in a different position on that. And so Russia reaps the benefits of the desire of Germany to get this pipeline completed.
That is what the administration is saying, but it is interesting just in the context of the German elections are coming. Angela Merkel's term as chancellor is going to be over come September. And the leading party, Ben, is the Green Party, which actually is opposed to Nord Stream 2 in Germany. So you're going to have all kinds of things happening potentially in coming months.
There's a lot of moving parts here, and I think that one of the things that we really have to appreciate about this decision is that it really undermines NATO in a lot of different ways. It does not serve our interest in terms of benefiting Russia's ability to influence Europe. And I think that one of the things that obviously President Biden ran on as a candidate was his criticism of the Trump administration as being too soft on Russia in a lot of different respects. You can debate whether that was true, but from my perspective, what we've seen in the early days from this administration is not something that indicates a hard line toward Russia. I will be very curious to see if in their conversation, Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden in the coming weeks, if they have any kind of conversation that includes the name Navalny. That is something that I think may not happen. And if that does not happen, it's an indication that this is an administration that is not willing to really stand up and hold the Russians' feet to the fire.
The opposition leader in Russia against Putin. Very quickly, Bill, the story about Ben Sasse, Senator Sasse, having a problem in grilling this nominee for general counsel for the Department of National Intelligence because he did work for Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications company that has been under fire and under sanction by the U.S. If through the prism of this happened in the Trump administration, how would it look tonight?
Yeah, well, everything would look different, and to the media, everything would be different. Ben Sasse can be very wrong, in my view, can be out on a limb sometimes. But today or yesterday, he was right. This very experienced Washington hand, this lawyer, acting as if he was just helping with administrative rules. When these administrative rules are things they can get around, so Huawei can continue its efforts. And remember, this is a regime that persecutes the Uyghurs, and we know about Huawei's role in that. It's really disgusting what's going on there.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.